All right. I think we are live. At least Google is telling me we're live. I'm relying on the credibility of Google to be truthful about whether we are live or not. I'm guessing we are. Welcome to another TPS Tech Talk, where we sort of look at the intersection of teaching with primary sources and technology. Looking at today, we're taking a peek at something that I have a serious interest in, and that is credibility with digital sources. And joining me are, again, my name is Taylor Kendall with the TPS program at MSU Denver, and also a colleague, Keith Patterson, with MSU Denver. And then we also have John Geiger from the TPS program at DePaul. Is it Geiger? Tell me if
It's
I'm wrong on
Giger,
that.
but that's all right.
From DePaul. So I really appreciate John bringing up this topic. I think it's couldn't be better timing as far as technology and education goes right now. So we are utilizing the Q&A app through Google+, so if any questions are pressing from the outside audience, please use that, and we'll sort of address them as we go here as we're having this fairly informal conversation. And we're also going to use Twitter, and I'll let John make mention of his program's Twitter account. We're at TPS MSU Denver, and we're pretty active on there too. So I think that's about it for the intro. I'm going to turn it directly over to John, since he sort of was the initiator of this topic, and we'll see where the conversation takes it. So John, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Taylor. Yeah, just to let everybody know, we'll try out the Twitter component of this. If you aren't getting the Q&A to work out, you can tweet at us, TPS DePaul, DEPAUL, and I put a comment on the Hangout page if you wanted to look at that. Hopefully it will update in live on the screen that I have here, and then we can go from there. Also, I think Taylor said that all of these Twitter moments are labeled with the hashtag TPS Tech Talk. So if you're interested in more of this, kind of stay tuned. There's plenty more Hangouts that we've got going on.
Thanks I forgot to mention that. Yeah, we've been pushing that hashtag as often as we can. So TPS TECHTALK. Anything from the Google or Twitter side, feel free to use that hashtag. Thanks for that mention, John.
Oh, no problem. I have it written down. So yeah, so I figured I'd talk today, or actually we'd talk today, about credibility, and I know that that's something that we talk about, accessing primary sources, and we really push the digital side of things to kind of democratize access, especially with the LOC collection. But a lot of times we have struggles with, is the source actually credible? Where did I get it from? And how can I kind of analyze that? We talk a lot about analyzing primary sources with our program, but there's another layer of making sure that the source itself is credible, and in turn that lends credibility to your argument and your project, or takes away from it, depending on what source you pick. So one of the things that we talk about as well is copyright, and I figured I'd just knock this out real quick. But just because you cite something doesn't mean that it's okay, it's gospel. I like to remind people that, and so we work a lot with public domain things, and a lot of times the copyright information is right there with it, or maybe adjacent. We have the benefit on LOC pages of a lot of that bibliographic info that's listed there, and that is an easy check. But then there are those times where you have to dig a little bit. That I know we like to share information back and forth as teachers and educators, and you may know you got it from Joe because Joe made it, but as that starts to get farther along, it's kind of like a telephone thing. How do you know where this really came from? What was the circumstance around it? I talk a lot as well about webcomics and people not attributing the original author, and that being a big problem. They just take a screenshot and they post that on their site. And it works the same with all these sources that we use. Is this a repost of something that actually came from somewhere else? Or is it something that we maybe need to dig along a little bit more on? So that's certainly one of the reasons this is kind of a big thing for me.
Do you think there's a misconception that, and I don't mean to take this in a different direction, but
No.
often I think there's an assumption that because it's a primary source, you don't have to worry about credibility because the credibility is inherent to the fact that it's primary.
Right.
Is that part of your thinking? Is that okay? That's there's certainly reliability built into it, but that doesn't mean discount the critical eye just because it's a primary source.
Absolutely. I use an example of Chronicling America. Newspapers have been newspapers, and there's always been bias. We talk about bias, and we talk about points of view. And that guy who maybe has an article in the paper from the early 1900s may not actually be a really credible person either. Kind of breaking it down a little bit and going, wait, this guy is full of hot air. Like he wasn't there, and this is not an accurate depiction of something. Use of the source, of course, you can say, well, I'm showing examples of people who are not credible. Okay, well, there you go.
Right.
But yeah, you can't just assume as well that, like if it's black and white, it must be a primary source. Well, you can't assume if it's a primary source, I'm good to go, and I can just put this in its gospel. So, that's what you were saying there?
Yeah, and it's I think all of us. This is a very TPS heavy crowd, obviously, that are involved in these and watching them. But I keep that in the back of my head. Is we those serious advocates of what primary source use can be, and the fact that they are typically authentic representations of a situation or an event or a time period, whatever it is. That there is still a level of, what bias is being brought into this, and I mean, I often those make the coolest sort of moments where you're like, oh, it is a true depiction of this event, but hold on, there was a clear angle on what they were trying to say with this beyond just whatever the photograph shows, or again, newspapers are a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and we talk. It's the same with getting sources from online. A lot of students think that you can just pull it. I mean, you all know this. You can just pull it from the internet, so it's good to go. But simple things that I learned being a librarian that you teach students about. Just look at the link, look at the author's background. Look at, is this an objective source? Is this Joe's superhistoryblog.com, or is this the LOC? And if Joe has a PhD.
Can you post a link to that blog, by the way? I want to make sure I visit Joe's.
Now, who knows? He may actually have a PhD from Stanford and knows his stuff, but Joe could also be a guy who has no idea what he's talking about. So that also then the sources that you get from that person, data is a primary source, but maybe the data that person has is desperately unreliable. So
it's totally a learned skill. I think I found just personally in the last, I don't know, 5 years, I've I used to just go to a site and immediately it was looking at the content. That's what you're at that specific page or at that digital source to do. You want to get the content out of it. But I feel like my thinking has shifted in a way where I don't even look at the content first. I'm not even concerned about that until I say, okay, where's a date on the page? Let me figure out who the author is, like getting that sort of foundational stuff out of the way quickly. And now I can do it pretty quick where I'm like, okay, that takes 2 minutes, but it's worth looking at that. The pieces that lend the credibility prior to even worrying about the content, because then I know it's worth looking at further.
Oh yeah, I think the first thing I do now, especially when I'm online, is I look at the URL, and if it's a really messy sort of obscure thing, I'm gonna immediately dive into more criticism. Versus, if I see something from the National Archives, like, all right, I could probably trust this. I'm not going to worry too much. And then, we get sources that we use that you see repeatedly. Like, we do things on the Chicago Fire for some of our programs, and there's a lot of secondary sources. I don't mean in the sense that we use primary and secondary. I mean that they're photoshopped or they're amended or they're based off of an original, but somebody's done a pretty good job of morphing it, and if you didn't pay close enough attention to it, you'd miss that little bit there and believe that that was the original.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up a quick example. I've used this in a few different contexts, but it's like the most in-your-face example of this. Hold on, let me see if I can find a better version here.
Hey Taylor, this is Keith. While you're doing that, Mary Johnson speaking, she had a question. It says, do you teach your students to find the real person or organization behind the website by going to whois.com? Pretty eye-opening. So I wonder if you have any comments about using tools like whois.com to kind of get to the root of the question.
Yeah. In the meantime here, I definitely, Whois, I've told people before, I think it depends sometimes on the audience as well, on just, like Taylor was saying, just instilling those practices as well, taking an eye on it. Whois is a really good site, though, and a lot of times even I tell people, just put that person's name into Google if you're really in doubt and see what comes up right off the bat. Because a lot of us now, especially with professional reputations, have enough populated online that you can see something. Now, of course, somebody who has a very generic name, then you have to dig a little deeper. But it's certainly a good skill to instill, like I was saying.
Yeah, I always find. Oh, I was just going to say, just my first thing whenever I'm dealing with new people is always, in any context, I tend to, hit Google real quick and just kind of do a quick check on who they are and what they've done and that sort of context. And I do that, professionally if we're working with a new organization or a new person and I'm trying to figure out, get a feel for, credibility and who they are and that sort of thing. So it's just, our world has expanded in so much just by the ability to spot check everything you look at. Which
Speaking of Google, I wanted to get your thought on the whole knowledge vault, and let me show this real quick since I brought it up, and then I wanted to actually discuss Google too, because I think it's really interesting what they're doing.
Sure.
This was the sample image that I've used quite a bit. That it usually comes along with a quote that says, don't believe everything on the internet just because it has a quote next to it or something, and then it's the tagline signed off. Abraham Lincoln said this. Anyway, if you want to just be in your face about being critical of sources on the internet, this is a good one, and it got a good Library of Congress tie too.
That's great. I also love breaking people's hearts with the whole TR on the moose thing.
Yeah,
because, that one looks absolutely believable.
Trudging through the river. Yeah, we have that. I don't know if we still do. We had that on our wall at one point.
Yeah, up until when we remodeled it, was hanging on our wall, and people would come in and go, "Did that really happen?" And I go, "Absolutely, it did." It was even tagged.
Go do the homework to figure out whether that's the case.
It's like, think about that for just a second. Did that really happen? So yeah, they're just fun. I think that people believe things that at value, like you said, because they're black and white and have a historical person in them, they have to be true.
Yeah. So are you guys familiar with what Google's doing with the whole? It's been called Knowledge Vault for a long time, and basically them, creating this database of factual information across the web, and now they're basically going to start ranking, or they, I can't remember. Keith, do you remember what that's going to be called?
I don't know. It's all part of their page ranking stuff, and they're trying to Google to have a kind of a credibility to the links that float to the top, or add credibility by, I don't know. Looks like you're in the process of looking at it, but I know that that's one of their things is they want the information that comes up in their search engine to be as high quality as possible. So.
Yeah, and I know that part of it is the idea of machine learning versus people learning and all that, and that gets into the whole argument of can machines sift that out better, or I know with, not to get off topic, but Amazon has their whole Mechanical Turk program, and you think it's being done by a machine, but it's actually people automating that whole thing. And for everybody out there, if you've never looked into this, it's fascinating. I think there was a couple of stories on it. But yeah, no, I know a little on the knowledge vault. Taylor, you seem like you have a little bit more, I guess, knowledge about about it.
I've just followed it a little bit, and I guess until recently, until they started saying they're really going to start building their sort of page ranking algorithms based off of what they think's factual. I hadn't looked into it any deeper, but I knew they were sort of building this factual sort of. There's a whole database behind Google that's it's factual. That's the problem. Is you can find sites that it says 2 + 2 is 4. Yes, fact. Good. That ranks you here. Right. But when you start getting into sources like the library deals with and things where it's like, well, where does factual build into stuff that has this bigger context around it? And I don't know enough about what they're doing to also bring something like the Library of Congress. You certainly wouldn't want that to fall down the ranks, based on their algorithms and things. I don't know enough about exactly how they make it work, but it seems really awesome and really promising, and at the same time, I question just how accurate it's going to be.
I think it comes down to the fundamental problem we are going to have a huge, we have to deal with it as humanity, is the amount of information that we're producing versus our ability to consume it. And and that's something that they're dealing with, is trying to get the best information to you. But what gets lost in that process, I guess, is.
It's like that image that you had of Lincoln with the phone and all. If that were, or any modified image then that maybe is linked off of an education site or something. Like, let's say you posted that to the TPS site for your program. Does Google then think that because it's a .edu and it's Lincoln and all, how far does it dig to verify that? Before maybe that is one of the credible results, or maybe it falls completely off and then punishes all your other material. So it's certainly interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm going to have to do a little more homework.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think that's kind of where it's at. It doesn't seem like they've gone far enough to start making any sort of big claims about what they're doing. And I hate for this to turn into this Google conversation, because the Library of Congress sources and what they do for credibility is obviously what we're after here.
Right.
But at the same time, there's not a single person here that doesn't use primary sources that doesn't also make use. Speaking of Google, that we're in a Google Hangout, it doesn't also make use of what they can do, and they are in a lot of ways controlling the knowledge of humanity. I mean, it's they really are in a big way. So it's promising to me. I don't have any doubt whether they really are trying to do it in a way that's good and that has the right intentions. I think that is the case. But again, it's a messy playing field they're dealing with.
Yeah, it gets back to that fundamental problem. Well, not necessarily a problem, but a cornucopia of information at the Library of Congress that the number one of the things you always hear is that there's just too much for a teacher to get through at the Library of Congress, and so it's a matter of what's the most relevant to them and giving good search strategies, and among them, we're talking about bias and credibility, and and those sorts of things. So I mean, it's those overall questions that we come up with.
Oh, I agree, and like you were saying, all of us use Google. I'd be a liar if I said that I don't use it, and it's okay as well. I think that we shouldn't shame people for using these things. but it's also, like we've said, understanding where your path is going, understanding kind of your surroundings as you go. It's to blindly trust is like just walking down the street with blinders on. You can't just assume that you're going to be in the right place. So definitely, going back to we share resources with each other, making sure that those things. Where did you get this? Where did it come from? You wouldn't just somebody hand you food and say eat this, and you're like, well, wait a second, where did this come from? Where what am I actually eating here? So it's when you take a source, you want to say, well, all right, this is great and cool, but where did it come from before I plug it in?
Yeah, I like that analogy of reading the label, kind of, because there's some things you have to consider. Yeah.
Yeah, and that all comes right back to the sort of fundamental skills that is what we opened up with, which whether you're talking about Google or a primary source, it's, I think one of the great things that we get to do is try to instill these skills where teachers and then students become really comfortable, and it becomes very second nature. Again, it took me a long time to not just be looking at the content and say, hold on, let me have this credibility lens that I kind of work through first, and now it happens really fast. But building the skills that allow that to be second nature prior to even worrying about what the content is, I think that's the key, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then making sure that we then the other side that I talk about is, if you're using these sources and they don't belong to you, if you're not the generator, to go ahead and just link to the original location. Go ahead and you don't necessarily have to make a copy for yourself. And sometimes that takes a little bit, that extra step of having to do that. You have to think about, okay, I'm linking to this guy's content. What is his background? What's the deal with this one? So I don't know. I think, like you were saying, it's a skill that you have to hammer into people.
Yeah. Kind of shifting gears, I was just thinking, I have a particular resource that I think I will pop up here in a second that I used to illustrate it. And it was one that actually one of the people who's on the call is Mary Johnson, actually was writing an article for Women's History Month about Colorado, and this image crossed my desk, and she was going to be using it at a workshop and asked me to print it out. And as I was printing it out, I discovered a credibility and bias thing. So let me see if I can get my screen share to work. So hopefully you're seeing that now. So let me zoom this in a little bit.
Ah, yes.
So I don't know.
Have you seen that source, John?
I do know that source. Yeah.
Let me zoom this in just a hair. So you look at this, and it looks like a fairly standard, just a nice suffrage picture, a little advertisement for getting out to vote, which doesn't look like much. This is actually interesting. It's in the Colorado primary source set. So it's very interesting. You go, oh, this is great, just a nice woman putting up a billboard. But as I printed it out and was looking at the digital file, if you really zoom in here, there's some issues here. If you look at around the lady, clearly there's some 100-year-old Photoshop going on.
Yep.
And
it's pretty good because it's believable at the fully zoomed out level.
Oh yeah.
But you get in there and it's clear. You can see where there was a billboard somewhere that they just cut out the content of it and stuck this message on in the frame, and then she was over top of it. I mean, even if you look at where the frame is here, it's the real world frame around the billboard is torn out, and you can see something underneath of it. I'm not sure exactly what message to get out of this, aside from you're not always looking at what you're looking at. And I don't know. I think what we came to the conclusion of with this particular one was that it was taken out of a scrapbook, where they kind of pieced it together for the scrapbook. Mm-hmm. But it could tell you a completely different story if you didn't know that. it did turn out we did find out this was a billboard that was up, and they must have just not had the ability to get a photograph of it, so they pieced it back together.
Yeah.
But interesting, and kind of, sometimes you need to take a closer look, especially, it was from the Library of Congress, it's posted up there, it's a featured thing, it's a very interesting content and relevant to education, but it's not quite what it seems. So
yeah, we've been fooling people for hundreds of years.
Nothing new. This actually is, I'm sure they had technology to do much more interesting things. There's things like the Brady photographs from the Civil War where he moves some people around on the battlefield, and there's good resources in the library about that sort of stuff. I don't know if you guys had any resources. You may not be able to pop them up quick enough by the time you hunt them down, but do you have anything that you use to illustrate, bias using primary sources and things of that nature?
Actually, you mentioned the Brady photos, and I'm not going to pull it up, but the migrant mother picture is one that instead of, because the last ones we've showed here are more like Photoshop-esque, so they're manipulation of the image itself. But the thing that we do with that is talk about, like you were just saying, manipulation of the people, and how we always take pictures as this gospel truth of this is what actually happened at the moment. But if you look at the series of pictures that Dorothea Lange took, you can kind of see that one image out of context of the series paints a very different picture than looking at the entire series. And I mean, like the Iwo Jima photo was a real photo, but they were staged. Now the actual event happened before, and they just, like you were saying in this last one, maybe it's the same idea of I want to capture this perfectly, but certainly even it doesn't have to be physically manipulated by technology to still not necessarily be what it appears.
I think this is, shows the power of one, having, a good historical background of things that actually are happening and not just relying your information on a single moment in time necessarily, and correlating other sources. All these skills that, the GPS program, will teach you if you go to the workshops, obviously. But no, a good point. And there's a lot of these very famous photographs that don't necessarily tell the whole story. They tell a piece of the story or pieces of the story.
Right.
Another an image I hadn't seen, but Dan B over on the Google Plus side had shared a source that I want to bring. He says, "Look at the melancholic days of scary Photoshop." Let me see if I'll bring this up and see if you guys have. I know we're running short on time. We like to keep these to about 40 minutes.
Sure.
But this is a pretty interesting one I had not seen. And if you look pretty closely, there's a really strange combination of very almost Van Gogh-esque melon, I guess, and then obviously an actual photograph too.
Good pun play also.
Yes.
On that one, Dan. Thanks.
Well played. Yeah, that somewhat reminds me of. I'm sure we've all seen the railroad cars with oranges as big as a house. Come out to California because the farming is so good that you'll only have to grow one orange a year to support yourself, kind of thing. But
yeah, it's definitely part of that. We talk about analysis through the observe reflect question and all these other skills, but it's just another chunk of analysis that maybe. I don't know if we should or shouldn't add that in the tool as much as just have that, like we were saying, be something that you're always aware of, like an umbrella to it. And maybe it is in a way part of each of those sections as well. Observe the creator and reflect on that and what other questions and things. So just other ways to tie those skills in without necessarily having to, I don't know, create a whole nother discussion for every single source.
Yeah.
And he also, just I had seen this photo, I was like, why does it look familiar? And so here's
oh, nice.
He shared the original as well.
Well, there's a perfect example of looking a little closer.
Yeah.
So that's...
I like the melon one better.
Awesome. Well, Dan, I appreciate you sharing those. That's great. That's a perfect illustration of exactly what we're...
Yeah, and if anybody else out there, who watches after the fact or whatever, post up on YouTube or Google Plus, wherever, if you have other examples of how you teach bias, or are there interesting things that I think everybody'd love to see those. So.
And now I make a correction because the name came up as Dan B, but I think now I'm realizing it's Dana from the library.
Oh.
So.
Sorry, Dana.
Dana, now we know. Thank you.
We don't know.
She probably has a whole stack of examples. She like knows all of this stuff.
Yeah, it'd be a fun workshop just to go through sort of pairs like that, looking at obviously that Lincoln photo. We could get the original without the phone on that one too.
We could call it something like the lies history told us. I don't know.
Make up on a future hangout.
I mean, and the thing I take away from this, is that I think it really, teachers and students, it lets you realize and should empower people to say, there are so many digital sources. We realize that there's, just this endless supply, and every single one of them has this sort of potential to be telling a secondary story, whether really overtly in some of these cases, or in some of the cases of like the Brady stuff, much more subtle, and those working at the library can't sort of sift through and find every little nuance and provide that information with the source. So in a lot of ways, we being everybody, can really become sort of the detective and piecing apart these things and telling the untold story of all these sources that I think almost probably is included in just about everything we see. So.
Yeah, and catching the new stuff as it comes out too. We generate primary sources every day, so making sure that we accurately represent it or accurately acknowledge that we got tricked. So.
Yeah, so it takes a lot sometimes to say, "Yep, I had that one wrong."
Yeah,
I've done it. It happens. All right. Well, we're at about a half an hour. I don't see. And Anna said she'd actually be able to talk offline. I'm sure she has a bunch of examples. I think maybe this is a cool example of this hangout. Maybe it's going to kind of morph into a potential something where we look at a lot of these sort of interesting
fingers crossed.
Yeah, so but I don't see any other questions, and we are at about a half hour. Do you guys have anything else? Maybe we'll give it a minute here in case anyone has any last questions that come through Google Plus.
Yeah, all I'd say is a good place to continue this conversation would be head over to the TPS Teachers Network and to the TPS Tech Group, and we can post some of these resources, links out to some of these stuff that we talked about, and maybe get a nice conversation going there.
Yeah, good call. All of these archived recordings as well will be up on the TPS Tech Talk YouTube page, which you can find through the TPS MSU Denver Google Plus page, and then also in the TPS Teachers Network. There is a group. If you search for the TPS Tech Talk group, all these archived recordings will also be available there, and we're hoping to continue to do them as often as we can. So feel free to suggest or continue to attend and view on the Google Plus side. We definitely appreciate those that were able to join in and get some questions in. And also thank you, John, for suggesting the topic. Again, I think we could go much further than 30 or 40 minutes on this.
Well, maybe we'll do it again sometime. So
yeah, I think we could do a part 2 and get a few other perspectives in on the presenter side. So.
Well, thank you, Taylor, and thank you, Keith, for joining me today.
Yep, thanks.
All right, until next time, guys, we will sign off. Thanks again, and again, TPS Tech Talk on Twitter, and again in the TPS Teachers Network. Definitely jump in there, and we'll have some fairly active conversations around all of these talks.